You are an IB history student and you're studying the Cold War, and today I will talk about containment, and I will try to answer the question, what is containment and how did it affect the development of the Cold War? Containment is the idea that communism must be contained. So immediately when you use the word containment, you will realize there are some assumptions involved, assumptions about world communism led by the Soviet Union in the post-war era, and that assumption is that communism is spreading, it's like a disease, so therefore it needs to be contained. The theoretical foundation of the containment policy can be found in the foreign policy analysis of George Kennan, a very important American diplomat and expert on the Soviet Union, who in 1946 sent a long telegram from Moscow to Washington, D.C., and followed that up in 1947 with an article called The Sources of Soviet Conduct, which was published in Foreign Affairs under the pseudonym Mr. X. So that's sometimes called Article X. So what did Kennan say? What are his points? What was his analysis? Well, he made about 4 points about the Soviet Union and its leadership. The first point he made was that the Soviet leadership, which of course was under the dictatorship of Stalin at the time, was a continuation of the Russian leadership for the past several centuries. In other words, it had a tendency to expand, it was aggressive, it was intent on empire, and it was somewhat neurotic or paranoid. To use George Kennan's words, the Russian leadership had a tendency towards Oriental secretiveness and conspiracy. So this is a theory that Timothy J. White has called the neurotic bear theory. The Russian leadership is big, aggressive, expanding, and cannot be predicted. It's like a neurotic bear. The second point is that when this neurotic bear is imbued with Marxist ideology, you have a hostile leadership which is committed to the idea of an inevitable clash between the communist world and the capitalist world. It does not have to happen right now, but according to Kennan's analysis, the Soviet leaders all believe that Marx has scientifically shown, Marx and Lenin have scientifically shown that there is an inevitable clash between the capitalist world and, as the Soviets would say, the socialist world, between the Soviet-led world and the American-led world. To back up his point, Kennan quotes Stalin from 1927. It's interesting that he should quote Stalin from 1927 because Stalin's outlook has certainly changed since 27. But Kennan quotes Stalin from 1927 where Stalin said, "There will emerge two centers of world significance, a socialist center drawing to itself the countries which tend towards socialism, and a capitalist center drawing to itself the countries that incline towards capitalism. Battle between these two centers for command of world economy will decide the fate of capitalism and communism in the entire world." End quote. That's a quotation from Stalin from 1927. It's interesting to compare that quotation and that idea to Roosevelt's idea, which was quite a bit different. I might get back to that later, but let's continue with Kennan's foreign policy analysis of the Soviet Union. So that was the second point, that all the communist leadership is committed to this idea of this irrevocable clash with the West. The third point is, since we have this neurotic bear that's committed to a hostile outlook and committed to this clash with the West, the neurotic bear must be contained, and it must be kept behind the line, and of course that line is already established in Europe as the Iron Curtain, and the communist power which is trying to expand must be contained. That's Kennan's third point. And his fourth point, which is the point that Kennan very much liked to emphasize during interviews later in life, later in his life, when he was looking back on the Cold War and he was considered one of the architects of the Cold War, Kennan was always trying to say, no, the Cold War didn't have to happen because of my policy analysis. Kennan's fourth point is that if communism is contained, then because of the contradictions in the communist system itself, because of the Oriental secretiveness, the paranoia, the confusion of Marxist ideology, etc., it will collapse. So, therefore, containment itself does not need to be aggressive. It just needs to draw the line and keep the line there, and then communism will eventually collapse. Eventually, it was not defined by Kennan, but there are those who believe that he was exactly right. It's just that eventually took about 45 years, whereas the assumption is he was thinking eventually would be less. However, those are Kennan's 4 points, and it's very important that you familiarize yourself with the gist of his arguments and his long telegram and Article X. These are very important documents in the origins of the Cold War. And as I said, they are the foundation of the containment policy. So how did this analysis manifest itself in U.S. foreign policy? Well, the two foundation stones of containment in terms of policy, not analysis, but in terms of policy, are the Truman Doctrine and the Marshall Plan. So in other words, we will back up containment with guns and butter. So what does that mean? Well, the Truman Doctrine, which was largely in response to the plea for help from the Greeks, the Greek royalists who were fighting communism in the Greek Civil War, especially after Britain said they could no longer finance that war. And also in Turkey, the situation in Turkey where communists were agitating and on the rise in Turkey in 1947, Truman announced his policy, which was now known as the Truman Doctrine, which is that the United States would lend help to its friends wherever they are fighting communism. Wherever communism is trying to spread, the United States will help its friends fight communism. So the Truman Doctrine is essentially, we will fight communism wherever it tries to spread beyond that line, beyond the containment line. So the Truman Doctrine does not apply to Eastern Europe, where there are already 5 to 10 million Russian troops or Soviet troops, and the U.S. does not have the will or the means to remove those troops. But any place where communism is spreading, such as potentially Greece or Turkey, the United States will fight against communism and will send military aid to its allies to fight against communism. That's the Truman Doctrine. That's one part of the containment policy. The other part of containment policy is the Marshall Plan. And that means that wherever communism has not yet spread, but the conditions for communism are ripe, in other words, there's poverty, suffering, and desperation, then the United States will help economically to get those economies on track so that those nations can become prosperous, and if they can become prosperous, then they will not be tempted to become communist. So this applies in particular to Western Europe, to Italy, to France, to the Western European nations, Britain, that benefited from the Marshall Plan, where the United States sent about $13 billion in aid and loans, including direct grants, for the Western European nations to go ahead and purchase products, mainly American products, of course, and that got their economies rolling, or at least that's what the American theorists saw. And this was helping those countries fight against communism in a different way by providing a prosperous capitalist alternative that would be more attractive to the countries of Western Europe than the communist way. So those are sort of the twin pillars, the foundation stones of containment. The basic idea of containment is you need to keep Stalin in a bottle, but the twin pillars are the Truman Doctrine and the Marshall Plan, in other words, guns and butter. So how did containment affect the development of the Cold War? Well, in January of 1950, the U.S. Undersecretary of State, Dean Acheson, gave a famous speech in Washington, D.C. to the press club where he said that the United States has drawn a defensive perimeter, a line, and that the Soviet Union would be kept behind that line. And in his speech, of course, he mentioned Japan, but he forgot to mention Korea. However, once the containment policy had been decided upon, any place where the Soviet Union and communism appeared to be spreading was a place that, through the Truman Doctrine, the United States needed to fight. So as soon as Kim Il-sung invaded South Korea on June 25, 1950, a very important date in the Cold War, the United States containment policy was being tested because it appeared quite clearly to the U.S. analysts and policymakers that here's an example of communism trying to spread, just as Kennan predicted it would do, and just as Truman said it would not be allowed to do. So the United States had to go to the United Nations and convince 15 other nations to join the U.S. and the Republic of Korea in fighting the Korean War. So because containment was the policy of the U.S., the Korean War was fought. The other alternative, of course, would have been to back down and to let Korea become a communist peninsula, but the U.S., because of its policy of containment, said, no, we have to fight. We have to fight according to the Truman Doctrine. So 2 to 3 million people lost their lives in the Korean War, and as you know, the communists drove down to Busan, were driven back up to the border, drove back in once the Chinese sent approximately 1 million troops in, and they ended up settling the Korean War. Well, it's not final yet, but the armistice ended up drawing the line very near where it started. So 3 years of warfare with nothing accomplished. But that's certainly one place where the policy of containment affected the development of the Cold War. The Taiwan Straits is another place where the policy of containment affected the development of the Cold War, because the U.S. decided that after 1949, once the People's Republic of China was declared and the nationalist government of Chiang Kai-shek moved to Taiwan, that communism would not be allowed to spread into Taiwan. Of course, Mao Zedong had other ideas, and he began shelling islands in the Taiwan Straits crisis, both of 1954 and 1958. And in both these cases, the United States moved the Navy in. The U.S. 7th Fleet came in and intimidated the Chinese, I suppose, but drew the line. Again, drew the defensive perimeter in the Taiwan Straits and said, communists, you will stay back there and you will not cross this line. That's clearly an example of how the policy of containment affected the development of the Cold War. The tensions were high between the United States and the People's Republic of China throughout the 1950s, and the U.S. considered using atomic weapons, as I've said in the past. And there's another case where we have the Cold War being shaped by the American policy of containment. Well, during the 1950s, we should also say that the United States did not interfere in Eastern Europe during the crisis in East Germany in 1953, when workers went on strike and dozens of people were shot and killed by the security police. The United States, I think through the U.S., the U.S. and West Germany combined to give some bread to the rioters, but that was about the extent of their aid. And of course, in Hungary in 1956, there were some Hungarians who were hoping for some sort of U.S. intervention, perhaps even military intervention, but because of the policy of containment, where the Soviets were going to be contained in the Soviet sphere, the U.S. did not interfere, because in this situation, the Soviets were already in Eastern Europe. They already had control over Hungary, so the United States decided not to get involved and not to support the Hungarian uprising of 1956, except in words and with a few leaflets that they dropped, and of course through Radio Free Europe. But there was no military aid, no military intervention at all. So we see that the Cold War, the development of the Cold War, took place along these lines, along this perimeter, that were shaped by the policy of containment. Of course, when Stalin died on March 5th of 1953, we now know that there was certainly a change in policy in the Kremlin, that there was a period of collective leadership. Of course, they executed Beria, and the Soviets wanted to make peace with the West. They abandoned one of Kenin's 4 points. They abandoned the idea that the West and the socialist world were irrevocably on a course of clash, a great clash of civilizations that Stalin had talked about in 1927. The Soviets abandoned that idea and suggested instead the idea of peaceful coexistence, that the socialist world and the capitalist world could compete peacefully. After the development of nuclear weapons, several of the Soviet leaders, and particularly Georgy Malenkov, felt that it was the duty of the Soviet Union to abandon this idea of the inevitable clash between the communist and the socialist worlds and to pursue peaceful coexistence instead. However, because of the U.S. being committed not only to the policies of containment, but also the theoretical analysis which underlies the policy, in other words, committed to this idea that it's the same old Soviets and they're trying to expand, they labeled the Soviet policy a peace offensive, sometimes known as a soft war, and because they were convinced it's just the same old Soviets, but they're being tricky now, they missed the chance for peace, particularly John Foster Dulles, the Secretary of State under Eisenhower. He could not believe the Soviets were actually changing their line, even though we now know that they were. And the ensuing period, especially after Khrushchev takes power, is known as the Khrushchev Thaw. And Khrushchev, of course, gives his secret speech in 1956, where he condemns the outrages of Stalinism. And it's clearly a new line in the Soviet Union, but because the U.S. is committed to this idea of containment, which assumes that the communists are trying to expand, the two sides missed the chance for peace, as it is called by Melvin Leffler, the historian from the University of Virginia, who wrote 5 essays about the Cold War in a book entitled For the Soul of Mankind, and he examines how the American commitment to containment misses this chance for peace in 1953, 54, 55. Another way that the policy of containment affected the Cold War was the disagreement about Germany. Once Germany was divided, which happened essentially in 1949, the Western side always saw East Germany as part of the Soviet sphere and abandoned ideas of German unification. And again, as I just said, during this chance for peace in the mid-50s, the Soviets were flexible in terms of their German policy, as you could see, because they agreed to withdraw the Soviet troops from Austria, and they might have been able to form a new policy about Germany, but the Americans were very much convinced that it was the same old Soviets and they were not going to give 1 inch of territory. And this is why Berlin became so sensitive and indeed became a focus of the Cold War, because Berlin is an island, or actually the word is an exclave, in the area where communism is being contained. It is an exclave of freedom, as the American policymakers would say. So Berlin becomes a focus of the energies of the Cold War, and on several occasions, including 1961, when the Berlin Wall is built, and of course at the end of the Cold War when the Berlin Wall falls, in 1963, during JFK's speech, during Reagan's speech, etc. Berlin airlift, of course. Berlin is a focus of the Cold War, and we see that the Cold War intensifies on that perimeter, on that line that runs down through the Iron Curtain in Europe and between China and the rest of Asia, and between North and South Korea, and between Taiwan and China, that wherever this line is, this line of containment is, we see frictions developing and we see flare-ups of the Cold War. So that's another way that the policy of containment affected the development of the Cold War.